Hello, my name is Arthur Frankel, and I am the founder and managing partner at Solution Street. Today I will be going through my experiences with Loopback.js. I had been looking at various full stack JavaScript frameworks and stumbled upon Loopback, which is an API, a Node API framework, and I was very intrigued by its use of convention over configuration and as a very lightweight framework that can be very powerful as needed. So what I'm trying to do here is just go through the major areas of an API server that I feel is necessary, and I will walk through some of those steps in a demo. Please look at the description of the YouTube video for more information and more links. So first, let me start with creating a basic skeleton app in Loopback. And the way to do that is first you would install Node. And this is assuming you have Node installed with npm. And then you would install, and globally, that's the -G, you would install strongloop. Strongloop was the original company that owned and created the open source product of Loopback. Now IBM bought strongloop, but you would just install the software this way. Once that is completed, you can create an application through scaffolding using SLC Loopback. So here what we'll do is we'll create an asset management system. So we will call this, let's call it asset management, and meaning that employees have assets. So they may have a computer, they may have a desk, they may have a mouse, a keyboard, and so maybe you're creating a system that keeps track of employees and their assets. So what is the name of the directory? Just hit enter. And which version? Currently the 2x version is stable. There is a 3x pre-release, but we'll just use the stable version. What sort of server do you want? Well, it defaults to the API server, which is what we're trying to look at today, with some authentication and authorization domains already built in, such as user. So we'll go ahead with that as the default. It creates the directory and several files and is automatically running npm install to get all the dependencies. So once this is done, which is pretty quick, we can see that I can start the server using, first I need to change into the directory, so asset management, and this is saying I can create models, which we'll do, and we can also, I will be using the CLI, the command line interface of SLC, strong loop command line interface, but there is a user interface called Arc that helps you actually do a lot of the things I'm doing command line interface, but also lets you deploy, profile, and monitor your environment. Some of these things, as you get higher into the capabilities, there is a cost related to it, but for the most part, you could do everything with open source and deploying and all of that without spending any money. So now I will do, I will start my server, and you can see it says web server listening at localhost 3000. So let's take a look at that. If I go to localhost 3000, we see just a ping back, which is telling you the server's been up, and it's been up for whatever, 8 seconds, I guess. But the real cool part of Loopback is that out of the box, the framework gives you this API Explorer, this RESTful API Explorer. And you can see there's the name of my asset management, the name of my project. We'll talk about tokens later. It has the base URL of API for my RESTful APIs, and I can version my APIs. But let's say I look at the user model, and I already have, out of the box, I have a bunch of RESTful API calls already built in. We'll get back to that when we create our own models. So let's now create our own models. Let's break out of this, and we will create our first model. So it's as simple as SLC loopback model. And let's create an employee model. So just because this is employees and their assets, so let's call it employee. Right now it defaults to a memory data source. We'll expand on that after. And we'll say this is persistent, which is the default. It'll be exposed to the REST API. The Explorer that we saw, it'll show up there, as well as could be hit from any client user interface. And we'll just set the plural form of employee. Now, sometimes because this is JavaScript, and you could have JavaScript on the server and the client, we will put these models in the common directory so that they could be used by either. In this demo, we won't be implementing any UI. We're just focusing on the server RESTful API calls. But in the future, we might build upon this demo and build some UI in front of it. We'll keep it a common. So let's first add a few properties. So obviously we might have something like first name, and that we get to choose the property type, and here we'll choose string. Is it required? We'll say no for the first name, and we'll have no default value. And let's say we'll have a last name, and that's also a string, and let's make that required, and we can have no default value. And if we hit enter, we're done with our model. And so we can start up our server again, and we will refresh our Explorer, and now we have an employee and user. So in the employee, we can see we have a bunch of APIs, and let's just insert an employee. So that's the normal RESTful, we'll post the normal RESTful API of posting to the employees URL. And what this is showing you is what the response will be, the model for the response, which is what comes back is the first name and last name and ID. And on the right here, you see what the request model is. So we can click on that. We don't need to pass in an ID because that is what comes back. And we can put in first name of Arthur and last name of Frankel. We try it out, and we get the response to be Arthur Frankel with an ID of 1. That's what you would expect. It's nice that that happens out of the box. Let's do one without a last name, which we said was required. And if we try that out, we get a response back that says validation error, the employee's instance not valid, last name can't be blank. So we can see that some of the validation is already built in here. So now if we get, let's say we get all employees, so we do a get of employees, we can just, we'll talk about filters, way to filter this, but we just try this out and we'll see that there's a collection, an array, and it's containing one entry of the employee model, which is me. So now, the other thing we can do is you'll notice that this request URL shows that instead of using this Explorer, we can just go to localhost/API, which is what our URL is for calling APIs, and we call the employees, get all employees, and this returns at a basic level just the JSON array of all employees. And we can see here there's the same information, whether we call it from the strongloop Explorer or we call it from just a basic URL. So if we take a look at, let's take a look at some of the code we have here. So I'm just going to use Atom and bring up the directory of our asset management system. And we can see just the directory structure. First, let's take a look at the client directory, which this is where you would have your front-end file. So we can, in Loopback, you could use anything if you want AngularJS or some native iOS or Android code. Whatever it is, you could use that in the client code. Obviously, if you're going to reuse some of the common directory, some of your JavaScript models, then you might have some JavaScript up here on the client. So in the common models directory, what do we have? We have an employee.js file and an employee.json file. So if we look at the JS file, there's nothing in it except an exports. This will eventually allow us, and we'll get to that, show you how to write custom methods. But by default, convention over configuration, Loopback gives you the CRUD processing, all of those RESTful APIs that we saw. I didn't go through all of them, but you can see here, if I close this, there is a variety of using gets, puts and posts and deletes to insert at least the CRUD operations, and then we have some additional operations that are available. And you can also, we can declare those as valid, or we can invalidate some of those operations if we don't want those available for this domain. So now we go back to our Atom IDE, and we can see that the JSON declares everything that we have said about this employee data model. The name, the plural, its persisted data model, that's where it's inherited from. Some other options that we can talk through, including validations and relations, any ACL authorization related to this. And then we have our properties. So I could just as easily add another field here. If I missed middle name, I could just continue on and enter my fields there. So I won't right now, but it's as simple as editing the JSON. So now let's create some relationships and show the different ways we can have relationships between models. So let's create another model called asset. So we will have asset model, and also memory, also persisted, also available through REST API. And let's add a few attributes. We'll have description, string. I'll make these all not required. We'll have a date property. We'll have a serial number. I'll just call that a string. And we will have a purchase price. I'll just have that as a number. Okay, so now we have another model. If we looked at Atom, we could see that it automatically generated the JSON, and it already added a container JavaScript file for any custom code we need. So let's just set up the relation. So SLC loopback relation. So here in our employee asset application, an employee could have one or more assets. And so each asset belongs to an employee. So let's just set up those relationships. The employee, as I said, has many assets. And we'll just default to the name of that relation as assets. And we'll just default to any foreign keys. And we don't need a through model because we don't have any additional functionality, but we could add it here. And we'll also add the fact that the asset belongs to an employee. So with that, we can see what was generated. In the employee JSON, we see that it has a relation set up that has many with assets. And in the asset JSON, we have a belongs to. Additionally, I'm going to start up the server again, And I'll just refresh this screen, and we now have our asset model. And you can see under employee that we now have the ability to post assets for the employee. So I can create an asset for the employee. Now, because my data source was memory, when I restarted my node server, I lost the employee that I created, the Arthur Frankel employee. So let me go back and just add that same employee. Make sure I have that employee ID 1. I go down to posting some assets for that employee. I can click on here, and let's just have a description of MacBook Pro and serial number 1234, purchase price 1,000, and we'll set up the we'll set up the ID here. We'll add the ID here because it's part of the URL. So if I do this, I now have a MacBook Pro associated with the employee ID employee ID of 1, who is Arthur. So you can see that this is very powerful right out of the bat, right out of the box in terms of the relationships, setting up your standard relationships, one-to-many, belongs to. You can have and establish just with setting up those relationships, you have the RESTful APIs that let you insert and get your information. So now I want to get the assets that belong to me. If I just do that, it will return my MacBook. So now, because our data source is memory, we'd rather have it connect to a database. So let's change that. So let's just do SLC loopback data source. And instead of memory, let's create a new data source. Let's call it Postgres. So I'll connect to a Postgres database. But you can see on the screen here that we have many choices. We have DB2, lots of IBM products, obviously, because IBM purchased strongloop. We have MongoDB, mySQL, Postgres, Oracle, Microsoft SQL. You could connect to other REST services, other SOAP services, and a whole bunch of other things that are either supported by strongloop or by the community. There's Elasticsearch here as well. So let's just create the connector for Postgres and connection strings. So let's just the host is localhost. I have it running locally. And so we're going to install the connector. So these are not installed right out of the bat. You have to add the data source, and then Loopback will install the appropriate connector. It's just an npm install command here. So now that I have that, we can take a look at. Oh, I didn't continue. Let me continue down the path. I explained the client in common. We obviously have a node modules directory that has what seems to be an endless supply of node modules libraries, which is pretty common with lots of frameworks, but at least those are not, that's typically not code that I have to edit, deal with. And if I remove that directory, I just run npm install and it gets recreated. On the server, we have several JSON files. So first we have a boot that deals with authentication and a root where it's starting from. This is how we see that loopback status. We have a component config, which is mounting the Explorer, the API, that nice UI, RESTful API Explorer that we see. That comes from here. Any configurations, cores, that is false here. We can change the root of our API, the URL root. Then we have data sources. So we just added Postgres. We see that here by default there's DB, which is a memory data source. And some middleware, which gives you more options. And then the models that we have, so because we started with the API server with some authorization authentication models, it has built-in user access token, ACL, role mapping, role, and then we add an employee and asset. So what we're going to do is change the data source here to be Postgres, which maps to our data source in the JSON file. And as simple as changing that JSON, and just to round out the conversation here, this is how the server starts. This is a typical server.js for a node module where you might have some boot things going on. And then outside of server, we have standard package JSON, which is what Loopback installed for us, and some other configurations. So now that we have that, I really need to migrate my data model because I created the employee and asset data models. So what I'll do is, and I have some copy and paste code here. I'm just going to do that just to simplify my life here. I will under server, and I'll create a new directory here. Let's call it bin, and under bin I'll create a new file called auto migration.js, doesn't matter. And what this code is doing is this is saying I'm going to reference my Postgres data source, and I'm going to auto migrate the asset and employee models. And so Loopback gives you this auto migrate function, which what that will do is that will delete if anything exists in your database related to the model and recreate it. There is also what you see here commented out is an auto update, which says, hey, maybe every time I start my server, if there are any changes, I will do an auto update, which figures out what the changes were to the data model and does the appropriate migration in the database. So I'm just going to auto migrate asset and employee. And so to run that, like any node JavaScript file, I will just do server/bin/auto migration. And this will use, I get a deprecation warning because I'm on the latest version of Node. I'm actually on Node, I think I'm on Node 7. Whoops, what is it? There we go. I'm on Node version 7, and so I think that version of Node with, I think Loopback, I'm on version 2x of Loopback, which may be a bit behind, so that's why I'm getting that deprecation warning. So now that I have that, I could look at my Postgres database. Let me just bring that up, and let me just connect to localhost here, and I'm looking at my asset management tables, and we can see that, let's just take I just don't have any data in the asset, but you can see that it has, my asset has a description, date acquired, serial number, purchase price, and ID of the asset, and employee ID, which is the foreign key back to the employee table. And the employee will have some first name and last name with its ID. So it's nice that we have that automatically out of the gate. So now let's try to insert some records into through the RESTful API. So I will refresh this. And remember, because I restarted Node, my data is lost from before. There was a memory database. I'm going to let's just create some new employees. We'll create Arthur Frankel. And we will create Joel Nyland. And then let's add some assets. So we will post some assets here. And I will say description MacBook Pro. Serial number 1234, and I will purchase price of $1,000. I will associate that with me, ID of 1. Looks good. I'll add another MacBook Pro to Joel, $2,000. He likes the fancier kinds. We have that, and I'll give myself a mouse. Oops, I have the same serial number, but maybe just do $10 for the mouse. And we'll add that for me. Okay. So now if we go to the assets, we get all assets. We should have 3 assets here. Let me see if I can see that. You can see my MacBook Pro, Joel's MacBook Pro, and my mouse. I could also just as easily go here to a URL and see the same information of the assets. So, and let's take a look at Postgres. If I bring up assets, I can view this data, and it's in the database. So that works very nicely. So now, I can use filtering. Let's say I didn't want to, in this case, I didn't want to bring back all of the assets. Or let's say I didn't want to bring back, I'm sorry, maybe not all the assets. Let's say I didn't want to bring back certain fields. Let's just start with that. So I can filter and say that I'm going to filter fields, and I don't want the date acquired to get returned. So now the date acquired is not returned. So anything I do in the URL here can be done in a JavaScript object. I'm just doing it in the URL, but we could do this programmatically. When we retrieve records, we could set up a JavaScript object to only select the fields we want. We could filter, we could return relations or not return relations. We can also do a where clause on a filter. So let's say I do where the description, I only want the description where it's the mouse. So that's that record returned. Additionally, you can hide APIs. So here we can see here that all of these APIs are available at a macro level for each of these domains, and then even the individual APIs are available. So if we didn't want our asset API to be available from a UI or from any call, RESTful call, we could easily go into the model config and change this public to false. And so that's how you hide. We'll talk about how we hide the individual or override the individual methods, but that's how you would hide at a macro level. So now the other thing we may want to do is write a custom method. So we have our employees and we have our assets. And let's say we wanted to get a total of assets for a specific employee, a total cost of assets for a specific employee. So I'm just going to, again, for simplicity, just copy some code here and I'll explain it all. So in our asset.js file, which is our container here, we can add a new method. And let me just clean up some code. So, whoops, did not do that correctly. I have the whole file copied. Okay, so as you remember before, we have the use strict and we have the module exports. So what I'm creating here is a get asset amount for employee. So I will get the total asset amount tied to this employee. I'm going to pass in the employee ID. And this is typical Node JavaScript on the server functionality. I'm doing callbacks. I'll show some promises after, but I'm doing basic asynchronous non-blocking I/O calls here. So I have the two main parts I will point out to do a custom method is one is the actual implementation method, which gets run when you call the function, and then the definition of the remote method. So let me first talk about the definition. So what I'm saying here is that I have this remote method, get asset amount for employee, which convention over configuration ties to here. And then I have a description, which is the description of the method, which shows up in the API Explorer. This accepts an ID, which is the ID of the employee, which is a number and required. And this is the path, and I can set that to be anything I want. It's a get method, and it will return an amount. It will return a number with the argument called amount. And so my functionality for that method is that I will do a find by ID. There's lots of methods that are available out of the box by Loopback, similar to, for those familiar with Rails and other similar type frameworks, where find by ID and all the find bys are given to you in terms of, you can have the generic find where you pass an aware clause, or you filter, or you find by ID where you're passing in a filter. So here I'm doing find by ID. So let's say I was going to find by ID of 1, which is the employee ID of Arthur Frankel, and I'm going to filter that. So this is the filter I set up. I want to include the relation of assets. So this helps me do the join. It helps me get the assets with the employee. And I only really care about the purchase price element. And so that will alter the SQL to just return the purchase price. So when I do that in the standard callback node server callback asynchronous function, I'm passing it. First I pass an error, and then I pass in the result, which would be the employee. So if there's an error, obviously I would do more than console log this error. Otherwise, my employee that gets returned, I'd convert it to JSON, and then I'm going to loop through the assets of that employee and add the purchase price. So at the end, I have the total purchase price of all assets for that employee. And then CB here is callback, which is the callback that I passed into this function. So callback, and I'm passing back the total amount. So let's take a look at how that works. I'm restarting my server. And I need to do that, but if I go to employee, we now see a remote method called, did I not do that right? Well, I'm sorry, I added it to the wrong function. I added to asset. This has to be added to employee. So let me do that. Let me just back up asset to be clean again, and so I have employee.js. I should have realized that because I'm in the employee.js and I'm passing an employee. So you noticed it did not give me an error. And I think that's interesting to note because a lot of this is based on JSON. A lot of this is determined at runtime for better or for worse. And so now when I refresh my screen here, I should see under employee, I should see the additional remote method get asset total for employee. Returns the asset amount for the employee. So if I pass in 1, which is the employee ID of Arthur Frankel, I get 1,010. So that is my MacBook Pro for $1,000 and my mouse for $10. And I guess you can't get a MacBook Pro these days for $1,000. But anyway, that shows you how to do a custom method in Loopback. So now let's try it with promises. Sometimes people are confused by callbacks, promises. Sometimes people are confused by promises. But let's just do a little bit of little changes here. Instead of this code here, where I'm using a traditional callback, I'll change that to be a promise. And so you can see the difference. There's nothing to do with Loopback here. I'm just showing that it supports it out of the box. So instead of doing the traditional function error, comma, result, and then I do a callback, what I'm doing here is I'm returning the result of this, and then after I do a find by ID, I'm using the then keyword. You can see I do a catch on the errors. Again, I would do something greater than doing a console log. A lot of people believe that this is simpler or more concise. It depends on your preference, but this works in the same way. I'll restart node and just show you that I can make the same call and get the same result of 110. You know, if I do Joel, here it should give you 2000. So, Loopback also provides hooks. So operational hooks like before save. So if I go to, I did not implement any of these, but they're pretty self-explanatory. We can see them in the, and I'll leave some of these links in the description of the YouTube video. If we go to Loopback.io, the documentation is very good, and you can see that, you know, a before save hook, and you can create these simply by altering the models in your JavaScript files. You could change the JavaScript to add hooks for before save or for any one of the other. Fast here. After save, before delete, loaded, persisted, on access. And that's useful. In many cases, you'll need to do that. Let's say you wanted to override an existing default like CRUD method. So let's say, for example, we have here the asset. We have here a delete on asset. So let's say instead of, if someone called this, instead of deleting, you wanted to do something else. So you can override the method simply by just changing the JavaScript. So in this example, we will override, what we're saying here is on data source attached, which is after you attach the data source, just note that anytime we call delete by ID, which is the actual function that gets called when you do a delete RESTful call, that we want to override that. So Loopback has listed in its documentation the different methods that you would call. For example, querying and gets of returning data would be a find method. And so you could override those methods simply by just redeclaring them and putting whatever you want in the code. So here we're just doing a console log override. We're not actually deleting. We're not going to call the actual function. We can, after do the console log, we can actually call the original function, but here we're just overriding it completely and just doing a console log. So we could see that here by starting node and going to our delete assets, and we can pick any number of an ID, and we'll try it out. It returns a 200 code, because if we look at our console, we've actually just overridden the function. So that's a nice way to just override out of the box. You know, again, convention over configuration. Override existing methods, CRUD methods, or anything that comes with Loopback. So another aspect to software development and API development is validations. And so typically you would have a standard set of validations and maybe a custom set of validations. So I'll just copy from my handy dandy cheat sheet here. And in the assets, let's say we want to, this is Loopback out of the box has a standard set of validations such as uniqueness of. So there's a collection of things that you can just use out of the box. So we want to make sure that serial number is unique. And so that's a standard validator. If we want a custom validator, we could just call the validate method and say we're going to validate the description field that and call our custom validator and say, well, if description equals description, we're going to throw an error. That's just a bad name. We don't want to use description as the name of for the field description. So again, I'll restart. Now, you notice I'm restarting all the time. you could use NodeMon. NodeMon is something I have installed globally, and that will check for any changes in your node server. So anytime I make a change in my server, I'll just do that. Right? I'll just add a few spaces. I'm automatically saving. If you didn't notice, it just restarted the server, and that's very nice to use. So let me create an actual. Let me try to create an asset here. So I will create an asset with a serial number 1234, which I know I've used before. Right? So let me get rid of strange things. So I think what should happen is, yeah, I should get this error that says serial number is not unique. So out of the box, I receive that. That's nice. Now, if I change the uniqueness there, but I change the description to description, I should get my custom validator kicking in. And I did, which says bad name, which is the text I use. And I can put anything there. Otherwise, if I change this to description as such, which adds something else, I now have inserted a new asset. Okay, it's not tied to any employee, but that's just the way my application works. So besides validations, other things you use, we mentioned before about access control lists. If we look at the model for employee JSON, we see here that there's a place for ACLs. Now you notice here there's validations. You could set up validations just in the JSON. I like it more in code. It's more apparent. It's easier to see, but you can put some of the basic validations in the JSON. For ACLs, they would go in here, and in order to add ACL and access control lists, what you would do is you could run the CLI to say Loopback ACL, and this is similar to operational hooks. I didn't implement any of these, but it's very easy to do. You can let's apply some ACL to all models and all methods and properties and the access type of all, and we can define the role of the user. Is this all users, any unauthenticated user, any authenticated user, anyone owning the object? And so you have access to do that. I'll add the link, but there is a nice link in the documentation that Loopback has in terms of talking about the different ways you can do controlling your data access. So let's just put it up on the screen. And this is a great page, great information on how you can restrict and define. And they give great examples of if you are the project owner or a guest, and whether you're authenticated, unauthenticated, a team member, an owner. So they give you lots of different ways to do that. Similarly, you may need to deal with authentication in terms of access tokens. And so you noticed up here in the Explorer that there's this access token. And what Loopback allows you to do is if I create a user, let me see if this works here. If I create a user, and user right now is connected to the memory DB, not Postgres. But if I believe if I post a new user, I think I could create a new username here. And I think, yeah, I believe, no, I need to create, add some credentials, which I think is password. So what you would do here is you would create a user with a password, and then you would log in with that user. So it gives you out of the box, it gives you the login, where you would log in, and once you logged in using this API, it would give you a token back. And that token can be used and placed here in the Explorer, which will help you continue testing out your ACL for any of your methods in any of your domains. Or it's the token that's used by your client, AngularJS, React, whatever it is, you could use that token as in relation to calling your APIs on your server. Another thing is CORS. By default, I think Loopback enables CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, out of the box. Although when I did look at, I did show before that there was a CORS parameter here. So I'm not sure if it is enabled or not anymore out of the box. But that's how you would deal with cross-origin resource sharing. ES6 support is becoming more and more the norm, and it really doesn't depend on Loopback. It depends on Node, and the version of Node I have is pretty advanced. It's pretty recent, I should say, and it supports. It is supporting ES6. So what I'll do here is I'll just create my models directory. Now, in addition to, you saw these are persistent models, and I could create other types of models that are not persistent. But here I'm just going to add a new file here just to show the power of doing what I want in Loopback. So I will add some class JS, and I have a basic class with a constructor and saying this.name is a good example of an ES6 class, and I have a method here, say name, that does a console log. So, and I export the sum class. This is just a very basic example, and then what I'll do is I'll call it. Let me just in my asset here. You'll notice I added the require for that class because it's something outside of Loopback. It's just a JS file that I added outside of Loopback. There may be a way to bypass the require here. You notice that for assets and employees, they don't have requires because it's all part of the framework. It's part of the JSON that gets fed into the framework. But here I have the require, and what I'll do here is I'll just add a few lines of code I'll do a let on sum class equals new sum class. So I'm instantiating the class, and then I'll just call the method just to show that I could do this for no other reason. Let's see if that starts. And this is getting called from my delete method in my assets. And just called it, and we can see that I'm a good example of an ES6 class. So I was easily able to add an external class object, ES6, and it all works wonderfully. The final thing I'll talk about today is logging and debugging. So developers always need good ways to log and debug. So let me talk about debugging first. I think so. Loopback provides a command called SLC debug, which works with Node Inspector. And what you're doing here, you have to remember, for those not familiar with Node and debugging JavaScript on the servers, that you are on the server. So if I start this is my server starting, and when it's to the point where it's ready, it should bring up the console log messages, as it just did, that I'm now ready. I'm now ready to do what I want. So if I put a breakpoint, if I go to my source and I put a breakpoint, I can put a breakpoint anywhere on the server. So I put it in the asset class here. So right before I do my console log for override, I can just hit the same method here. You can see I'm now in some wait mode because I'm current on that line of code. I've had different success, different feelings about SLC debug for some others, but this does work at some level. I can look at some class, although I've had some, and you can see that it is some class, and that works. Now the alternative here, if I just continue this running, the alternative is you can now run Node using Chrome tools for debugging. So if I run node inspect, and I will just break on the first line and copy this URL into my browser. I'm now in Chrome Tools, so debugging my Loopback application. Looks similar, but it's a little bit better. It's a little bit nicer interface, works a little bit better, and in the same way I could do my debugging here. I'm starting, it's faster. For some reason it seems much faster, to me anyway. So I get to my code, and let's just do the same thing. And now at that point I can, as if you were debugging on the client, so I already have some class, I see the example here, and I can go to my console. See, I'm not at a point in my console where I'm stopped. This is what I still struggle with a little bit of this, where it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. But you can see that you can do all the things that you can do on the browser in terms of watch, in terms of scope, of what's in scope. I have access to the callback here, and my actual asset model constructor. So I have access to a lot of things, which is very good. Even more than this, I wanted something similar to like a Rails console. So I did find there is a tool, and this, if we go to GitHub, this is a community supported tool, community built tool. So there is a Loopback console, and this is good to show because you could bring in any module here. So what we'll do is I'll first do an npm install Loopback console and -- save, which will update my package JSON file, and this will install the console component. And then after that's done, which it's done, I'll update my package JSON because I want to run this using an npm run command. So I'll just do a console and then call Loopback console. So now what I could do is I could do npm run console, and this brings up, again, just to ignore the deprecation warning. This brings up a nice console where I can look at models. These are the models I have. These were the default ones that came with Loopback, and these were the ones I added. I have access to the entire app, what the app has. So if I look at app, this is a large set of information. I'm flying by here through the terminal, but you can see this tremendous amount of information I have access to. And I can even do calls like, let's say I want to just find all the assets. So I just do an asset.find. If I want to do an asset.find where, let's say, this description is mouse, I could do that. I think I got that right. Right. And I could do a create, right? So I could create a new object, and that will save it to the database. So this is very useful for debugging and doing what lots of Rails developers love, which is logically go through some of your application, what you're building through the console before you start writing code. I think it's exit. Yeah. So in summary, those are the major aspects to, I guess, what I consider the 80% of what software developers tend to worry about with building a traditional business app, whether it's models or relationships or it's validations. I didn't get too much into error handling because that is part of just Node in itself, and promises and all of the other things that go along with Node and non-blocking I/O, asynchronousness. But this gives a flavor of Loopback. I've been very impressed with Loopback. I love the fact that it's very light, that there's not a lot of code. It's not a generated code base. It just has a very small number of files in JSON format. You could override the JavaScript. I'm not sure where Loopback is in terms of community, if it's on the upswing or the downswing. Like many of us, we are battling with so many different JavaScript frameworks, but this is one that I do enjoy and will probably be using on some projects shortly. Thank you for your time.